Welcome to Kali Tribune podcast. Question and answer session, episode Unterwegs zu Heidegger Cul-De-Sac, part 2. In this part of the podcast, we'll focus on actual Heidegger interpretation of ancient Greek metaphysics, and be even more precise and focus on his interpretation of Aristotle and few Aristotle's key concepts. Now, reason for this is that it is quite easy to give a broad outline of what one thinks of Heidegger, as I did in the first episode, but it's completely another matter to demonstrate the truth of this broad outline. I believe that this truth is in fact quite easily demonstrable from reading actual Heidegger's texts. In this time around, we'll concentrate on some passages from the series of Heidegger's lectures, that is a lectures course in ancient philosophy he held in 1924, and it is being published as a part of Heidegger's Gesamtausgabe, I think in 2002, so relatively recently, going by the name Grundbegriffe der Aristotelischen Philosophie. Of course, we won't read everything, but we'll read key passages and say a few words about this peculiar way of proving that the whole of metaphysics, the whole of the 2,500 years tradition is simply on the way of distorting the original position or the source of what should be authentic, as Heidegger liked to say, eigentlich relation to being. Now, in broad outline, first one thing about Heidegger's method. Heidegger presumes that every great philosopher, in laying out his philosophy, by revealing a kind of outline of truth that he grasped, at the same time conceals its origin. So every revealing for Heidegger is also concealing. So the presumption is that, for instance, if you take Aristotle, everything that is revealed by Aristotle, and we'll go into what Heidegger considers revealed, because it's not, we can't just claim that he correctly represents even that what he considers revealed. Something is concealed, and this concealed thing, with a big T I would add, is what he called thing of thinking, the being itself. So Heidegger tries to, as he likes to call it, through so-called destruction of traditional ontology, the term taken from early Heidegger, Zeit, he claims that he tries to soften up the petrified layers of tradition to let the living and beating heart of this tradition shine through. That's what he wants us to believe. In this podcast, we will demonstrate, and I'm not, as you see, using conditional here, that this is wrong, and this is even worse than wrong. This is, I think, and I believe I can demonstrate even this unintentional lie on behalf of Heidegger. Now, I'm taking Aristotle here, although maybe Plato would be even better example, because Heidegger harbored a much greater dislike for Plato. But as Han Fei, the reader on whose behest I'm doing this podcast, pointed me to a certain author publishing on the Countercurrents website, white nationalist website, where he wrote, when this author wrote about Heidegger's critique of metaphysics, laying out Heidegger's philosophy in a broad outline, and used it to criticize, for instance, René Guénon and such thinkers. And since first reason why I won't go in depth into all 5 essays is because I haven't got time for that. The other reason I will explain at the end of this podcast, because then it will become obvious why I don't want to bother with going passage by passage into what this author wrote. I'll just quote one passage where he says something about Aristotle, Heidegger's interpretation of Aristotle's, or rather what he thinks that Heidegger thought of and how he interpreted Aristotle, and a remark about translation of Aristotle's terms in Latin. Because if we have this passage in mind, while we go through Heidegger's actual interpretation of Aristotle's text, that is, in the end we'll see that how wrong and inverted it is, both Heidegger's interpretation and both this inversion of Heidegger's inverted interpretation, because it is not only inaccurate, but it is also perverting not only Aristotle, perverted enough by Heidegger himself, but actually perverting things even further. So without further ado, I'm going to read this passage. I'm not putting links because this website, Countercurrents, is not the website I want linked to my Kali Tribune, for various reasons, and I'm not very eager to have their readers read me also. So the passage goes in a following way, that is, Colin Cleary is writing about the philosophical term energeia, its translation in Latin actualitas, and he is doing this through Heidegger's lenses. Or he believes that he's doing it through Heidegger's lenses, but this is not entirely accurate, as we shall see. Therefore, quote, consider the connotation of actualitas, which is offered as a stand-in for energeia. Actualitas is a late Latin term derived from Latin actus, that is act or action, which is derived in turn from agere, to act or to do. At least initially, it thus seems a plausible translation of energeia, which is derived from energos, active, which comes from en plus ergon, work or doing. Thus, energeia literally means in act, or we could say in doing, if we want to avoid Latin entirely. However, the sense of Latin actualis, the actual, and actualitas shifts over time, and it is already shifting in the Middle Ages when actualitas is used to translate energeia. One can easily see how this is the case if one simply considers the way in which actual and actuality are used outside of the context of talking about Aristotelian philosophy. When I say that something is actual, I mean that it is real, and the less often used actuality means the same thing as reality. For example, if someone says there actually was election fraud or there were actual cases of election fraud, they are asserting that something is real and not imaginary or invented. I have to interpolate just one thing here that is not entirely relevant, but I have to say this. This man obviously believes that everybody thinks in English. Actualitas is not an English word, and actually is actuality as reality is not Latin, it's English, and he's using English here because how I know this? Because I'm not English speaker originally, and I wouldn't use this word. I would use the Croatian word which is quite in tune with both actualitas and energeia, because actualitas is perfect translation of energeia and the meaning is the same, as we shall see. I'll try to demonstrate this, by the way, but it is not necessary for a discussion. We'll see if there will be time. Just to interpolate this here, and this is very I don't know how to call it, very, very naive, let's be polite, very naive understanding of a relationship of philosophy and language. So the actual is, and I'm skipping a passage here, is in effect what is really out there. Actuality then means something like the sum total of what is really out there. In both cases, the concept is founded on a distinction between in here, in my mind, in my imagination, versus the out there. We are now far, far removed from actuality as the in-act, in-doing of Aristotle's Energeia. I have said that Aristotle used Energeia to talk about the being of a thing, but he was decidedly not using this term to talk about the fact that things are real or out there. In fact, this construal being never comes up in Aristotle. Let us stop here, end passage. Now, I presume that this author thinks that Heidegger shares his opinion about Aristotle's understanding of Energeia, but as a matter of fact, he doesn't. According to Heidegger, Aristotle Energeia in Werk sein is precisely the term for being as presence. Heidegger does not understand Energeia as actualis. In fact, he doesn't understand it as Energeia at all. That's very interesting. He doesn't understand it in the way both Aristotle and medieval philosophers and theologians understood it. And this will be demonstrated by his interpretation of some passages of Aristotle. We'll extract from his lectures, that is to say his seminary on Aristotle. Now, this means that this passage is is in fact redundant, because the Heidegger's thesis about oblivion of being already applies for Aristotle and Plato. For the same reason, it applies to Middle Ages and later. So Energeia is the expression for Heidegger, expression of presence, of Gegenwart, in the form of, as we shall see, its Greek synonym entelehia, that he translates in a specific way in Fertigsein. And this Fertigsein, we'll explain this later. So just to note that clearly, obviously haven't read Heidegger that attentively, and we must remedy that also. As I announced in the first episode of this podcast, we'll start from the affirmative, from the positive statement of what is Energeia for Aristotle, and then we'll proceed to see what Heidegger does of it. And in the process of stating what Energeia is, we'll also state what the movement is. Because in the passage I'll just quote now, Aristotle talks about both and gives us a very clear differentiation between them. And please remember, being in movement and being in Energeia is not the same thing. So this is from Aristotle's Metaphysics, book Theta, book 9. And the quote goes like this. From actions, this is praxeon in Greek, praxis is action, which are limited, not a single one is an end or purpose, telos, but they are rather towards the end or purpose. As in thinning or going thin, removing fat, the end purpose is thinness, to be thin, and bodily parts, in the midst of thinning or removing the fat, are in such movement, please note kinesis, that thinning doesn't belong to a final why of the movement. So their movement is not an action, or at least not the perfect one. Therefore, just to interpolate, because the end, that is to say the why, the final cause or purpose of the movement, is not part of the movement, it is after the movement. For it is not an end, but movement in which the end is present is an act. As for example, seeing is simultaneous with have seen, comprehending and have comprehended, thinking and have thought, but it is not simultaneous to learn and to be learned, or to heal and to be healed. However, it is simultaneous to be living good and to have lived good, to be living a good life and to have lived a good life. Good life, or blessed, being blessed, this eudaimonia in Greek. This is the purpose, highest purpose of human life for Aristotle. If not, the action would have to end at some point, as in the case of thinning and being thinned, but it doesn't, and one lives and simultaneously have lived, or has been living, as I sometimes translate it quite wrongly. This is perfect, simple perfect tense in Aristotle. Therefore, one form of those should be called movements, whereas the others are acts or energeias. For every movement is imperfect, that is to say unfulfilled, that is thinning, learning, walking, building. Those are movements and hence unfulfilled. For it is not true that something walks and simultaneously has walked, builds and has built. Aristotle loves to repeat himself. Coming into being and has been in being, or is moving and has been moving. But the thing moved is different from the mover. However, it is same to be seeing and to have seen, and thinking and to have thought. Therefore, one is a movement and the other is act. So that was Aristotle in book Theta. Now, let us see what it means. Energeia differs from kinesis or movement in this, that kinesis is atelon. It doesn't have inherent, that is intrinsic end. Now this word end has more than one meaning in Aristotle, but all meanings, as Aristotle would say, are according to one principal meaning. In this sense, it is the meaning of purpose. So the purpose of movement, and he gave us few examples, as for example, in the movement of building a house, the purpose is outside of the activity. So movement is a form of activity, and using the word activity, I'm just translating energeia, but I don't mean necessarily work by this. I mean activity. Activity is a higher term than work, and we'll have a few words to say about this, because this is something that Heidegger would disagree. House is outside of the activity of building. But as Aristotle says, when we take, for instance, sight, activity, the end of sight, the telos of sight, is inherent to sight itself. So he can say this somewhat peculiar sentence, namely that it is simultaneous to see and to have seen, that there is no discrepancy between present and perfect in activity, in energeia. And this is what differs it from the mere kinesis or movement. Now, why is this and what does this mean? First of all, understanding of time as a series of nows is not something that can be applied to any energeia if it is understood in a pure sense. And this purity has a relative, let's say, relative degrees. At some degree, as is the case in living, in seeing, in thinking especially, this degree is already such that it is above movement. So me seeing something is not my sight being moved, my sight being in movement, as if this sense is in movement, although sometimes Aristotle will use, for the sake of clarity or brevity, the expression that, for instance, sight is moved, but then he thinks what he talks about actually is the physical organ that has been moved, but the activity itself is not movement. And this means that temporality of Energeia is such that it is not a series of discrete moments, but that it is a continuous whole. It is fulfilling, being fulfilled. You can call it fulfilled, but I am stressing this being fulfilled because in English, therefore, I stress the fact that activity has to be understood in act. It must not be understood as something petrified. It is going on, but in the sense that there is no discrepancy between various moments of this going on. It's a kind of like, one could say, an image of what eternity should be. And think about it. One very good example of this is health, being healthy. Ask yourself, when you are healthy, can you really imagine the state of being sick? By imagine, can you really evoke the experience of sickness? The whole change in your psychology and this change in the state of your mind when you are sick. Those two states, being healthy and being sick, kinda don't mix together, and this is essential. Energeia does not let in itself its opposite. Energeia cannot suffer its opposite to exist in it in intrinsic sense. So seeing cannot be joined to blindness. When we say, for instance, I used to have sight and now I am blind, you cannot say really, if you want to be strictly correct in Aristotelian terms, that I used to see but now I don't see. Correct thing would be, I used to have sight, but now I don't have it. Or, man used to live, but now he is dead. While he was alive and he is alive. Because in life, when he is in life itself, there is no death in life. There can be all kinds of oppositions to life in a relative sense, but this absolute opposition cannot be admitted in the Energeia. In movement, on the other hand, it can, because movement is a kind of phenomena of in between, because movement is something between Energeia and dynamis. That is the conceptual pair to Energeia and its complementary opposite. Dynamis is, of course, potentiality or capability that has ontological status. Nevertheless, it is something that can be, but still isn't. And now let's see how Aristotle defines movement. And we skip now to the book Metaphysics, the second philosophy, what is of the lower status, of course, than first philosophy that we nowadays call metaphysics. Now, just a note, I will peruse in this commentary, because now we'll commence the commentary of Heidegger too. Excellent articles by author Francisco J. Gonzalez professor of philosophy, I think in Ottawa University. One is about precisely this problem of Heidegger's interpretation of metaphysics of Energeia, and other is on Nichomahean Ethics, but I won't quote from the second one. Now I will use the translations I'll use of Aristotle will be partly mine, partly what is given in Croatian translation, and partly from Sir David Ross. I make a combination of terms to try to be the most accurate, and Heidegger's translations I quote according to Suarez and according to Heidegger's lectures on Aristotle's the Grundbegriffe, that the Aristotelische Philosophie from 1924. That was his lecture course. So this is the definition of movement in Aristotle's physics, in book Gamma. Hetu dynameiontos entelehia hetuton kinesin estin. Motion is the activization or realization of energization. Therefore I translate entelehia, of that which is capable as such. So motion is actualization of capable or potential as such. It is a passage from potentiality to actuality, but please note it is a passage. It is not actuality per se, a passage. It is the phenomenon of in between. Now let's see how Heidegger translates this, and then we jump right in the midst of the problem. Heidegger says, motion is the being present, two words as one, Gegenwart, of what is capable of being there, also two words as one, as such. So in translation, Gegenwart, being present, is his translation of the word entelehia, whereas being there is his translation of the word kinesis. Now Heidegger gives example of this, what this means. This means that if we have before us a piece of wood, for instance, the presence of this piece of wood is motion. How is this possible? Because I'm sure that most of you now think, or your first impression is that this piece of wood is actually at rest. Well, no, says Heidegger, and now we'll see how he proves that this resting, unmoving piece of wood is in fact in movement. Heidegger says, and I quote, insofar as it is there, the piece of wood is in motion. Insofar as it is genuinely there, as capable of being a box, it is in motion. End quote. Now, what is this capable of being a box? This is like one word. Heidegger connects those words like to show you a phenomenon that you cannot see yourself. This is phenomenology. They take chair and say this is a chair present, and this is very deep philosophical truth apparently, and I am only ridiculing them, satirizing this a bit. This is to some extent this is literary what they end up with. So what does this mean? Well, simple. Heidegger works on assumption that being there, that is, motion is being there, let us remember, is convertible with a quality of Bedeutsamkeit, of significance. And this means that every being of this kind, being there, present being, has this Bedeutsamkeit, that it is for the will of something, for something, that is from to, something from to. And this is why he uses the example of a box, because a movement is being capable of being used in the production of a box. So this is, for Heidegger, this is movement. Still, we see that there is no movement in this movement, because, let me say, Aristotle would of course not accept this, because kinesis for him is not understood through this Bedeutsamkeit, it is understood through Energeia primarily, because lower is always understood through higher. And Energeia is what qualifies it, what brings it to light, so to speak. But this Energeia is not the act of technical production, which for Heidegger it is. Heidegger here understands movement as possibility of producing something. Supposedly not only artificial thing, but also natural thing. The trouble is that Aristotle doesn't treat anything as a possibility of something when he is looking to define something that is crucially important. He is trying to define actuality of something, and this is in fact the opposite approach. For Heidegger, the essence of a thing is a possibility of a thing, because he stands in this long German tradition of looking for so-called conditions of possibility of something in order to explain something. So, for instance, you have this very pronounced in Kant, when Kant say that transcendental principle is the principle that gives you conditions of possibility of something. So, for instance, transcendental principle of being in general is that everything has to be in time and space and in the categories of reason as causality, quantity, quality, and such. These are conditions of possibility. Now, in original meaning of transcendental, and let us skip to Latin age, Middle Ages, for a moment, the meaning is completely opposite, diametrically opposite of this. Transcendental, if you would to say that there is a transcendental principle, that would be purely actual principle. You cannot talk about conditions of possibility. You can sometimes perhaps never even not define it, but you are defining everything else in the light of it, because your mind participates in it, it energizes the mind, one could say, it enlightens it. So it's a completely different thing. When you talk about possibilities, in this sense that, and essence is an expression of Energeia, it is what you get, a logos, that you get from the act of being. Act of being is also entelehia or Energeia, translation or paraphrase of this Greek Aristotelian original, Neoplatonic. So it's when you talk about possibility, you are talking about res. When you talk about actuality, you are talking about ens, because High Middle Ages scholastics made a difference between being as ens and being as res. Being as ens is being in act, actual being. Doesn't mean being there, by the way, or present being, but energeion. Actual, literary, they translate Energeia literary as Aristotle understands it here. So when you're talking about actual being, it's not like you are talking about possible being. Possible being, that is to say, being understood in the mode of possibilities, is res. And this is something that you define in a kind of methodical imagination. When you create concepts really in your head, one could say, which was not so often done in scholastics, because most of the time they were trying to resolve to the causes and give demonstration of actual things. So they didn't believe that you can kind of like step out of the experience, as is done by Kant and his followers, and then try to imagine this experience in a kind of mathematical, methodical imagination, something that Descartes also did. And then give this definition of possibilities that are necessary for something to be. This is not something that, for instance, Thomas Aquinas do, but this is also not something that Aristotle would do. The consequence is that Aristotle, it's very simple. Kinesis, of movement, is a passage from possibility to actuality in nature and in techne, in production. But techne, for Aristotle, is not exactly even mode of being. It's a human activity that is whose purpose is always outside of activity, as we have seen from the examples from the first quote from Aristotle's Metaphysics. So every movement is from contraries. For instance, from dynamis to energeia, which are complementary contraries. From not being in movement to moving, from something great that is diminished into something smaller, for something healthy that gets corrupted, from something move here to there, and so on. Heidegger, on the other hand, claims here that movement is in fact rest that has necessary capability of movement, in the sense that it can be used as something bedeutsam, as a part of the meaningful structure that has, in fact, technical nature. And this is something that he developed later in his Sein und Zeit, the Being and Time, where he sees the first relation of this Dasein, this kind of his radical subject, one could call it, that the primary relation to the world is through care, Sorge, to being concerned with the world, which is also expressed through this constant attempt to work on things, to give them meaning through production, through whole system of meaningful, in fact, technical relations that at some point break down in the experience, so-called ontological mood of angst, where every meaning is lost because it is obvious that no meaning has actual foundation, that everything's founded on nothing, and pure nothingness is a pure possibility, in fact. But this is already going too far, and I cannot really go into all these intricacies of Heidegger's early philosophy that he more or less rejected anyway, so why bother? So let us proceed. Now, obviously, kinesis, or Bedeutsamkeit in Heidegger, which is, as I think we can already see, the precise opposite of what Aristotle means, is understood in relation, at least, to Energeia and entelehia, the synonyms. Well, Heidegger wants to prove that Energeia in Werksein and entelehia Fertigsein means being finished. Something being finished in a completely final sense, in the sense of present now, or Gegenwart, presence, that they are in fact two terms, two phenomena. And let us see how he does it, and I'll quote from Aristotle's Metaphysica Theta, with some explanations of translation, helping myself with Professor Gonzalez and David Ross, and Croatian translation, and my own knowledge of Greek as it is. So Aristotle says, listen to this sentence: Energeia tunoma heprosten enteleian sintitchemen ne. This one, I'm sorry, sintitchemen ne. Energeia. Energeia tunoma heprosten enteleian sintitchemen energeia. This means the word or the name energeia we posit as stretching to also upon entelehia. This means that the word energeia is also used for what we call energeia is also called entelehia. Very simple. And now what Heidegger does through interpolation of different form of one of the words, he translates the text as meaning that Energeia spannt sich aus zum Ende, stretches itself towards the end. You know what this means? He wants to say that Energeia is something that is not directed towards entelehia, that those are two things. And therefore he ejects the real meaning of the sentence, and the real meaning of the sentence was that the meaning of the word stretches to encompass the meaning of another word. This is what he does. I can't go now in the lengthy philological explanation, but the very fact, anybody who knows ancient Greek, I think anybody with any sense will tell you that this is the thing. And what he does is he's intentionally manipulating the Greek language to fool his students into thinking that those are two different things. Now why? Because he wants to understand Energeia as in Werk sein, being in work. And he uses, as you remember from Cleary's passage, this word comes from the ergon, work. But it doesn't mean being in work, it means, it would be in German, in tat sein, being in act. It's not being in work, and it is obvious in many places Aristotle uses it in the sense that cannot mean work, that means act. For instance, in Nichomahean Ethics, in the very first book, quote, ergon of man is the soul's energeia in accordance with reason. This is a catalogon. Energeia catalogon. And this means the act of man, the proper act from the essence of man, which defines man, because essence, as you see, is defined through act, not through possibility. And this applies for Greeks, for Aristotle, this applies for Aquinas. Not for every scholastics, unfortunately, but for high scholastic, this Latin scholastic, absolutely applies. The first is act of being, then you have logos definition from this. It comes from activity, not from possibilities. It's not subjectivist, that is. So the act of man that defines his essence is energeia, activity in accordance with reason. Therefore not work in accordance with reason, because praxis and poiesis are not the same thing. Praxis is also a form of energeia. It is synonymous with energeia when we are talking about deliberate being that is capable of deliberation. That is to say, in Aristotle's context, human being. I'm sorry, he applies it to God even, but we won't go into theology. It's very interesting, and this is the story in itself. It's very interesting how Marxists, that is to say, young Marx, uses this distinction also to obfuscate the truth, but in a quite more clever way than Heidegger, I would say, but this is story in itself. Praxis is such activity that the end of activity is inherent to activity itself. That is to say, the purpose is in there. If you are a good man, if you are acting good, the purpose of your act is not outside of your act. And it's simple as that. Whereas if you are a good builder, the purpose and the evidence of your goodness is in what you produced, and then laid back smoke your cigar and enjoy the accolades of your peers. So it's obviously different thing. And Heidegger wants to conflate this. So it's not in work design. And why he likes this Arbeit and Werk? Because he's trying to show that presence, metaphysics of presence, that he's trying to read into Aristotle, although it is completely absent from Aristotle, is based upon this technical relationship to the world, and the world understood as a tool shed in a way. And he's trying to, because in his so-called fundamental ontology in Sein und Zeit, this is what he starts with. And I have to note one thing here. The way he proceeds is such that he takes these things that are fairly common sense, that are fairly easy to perceive with your mind, and then goes on to turn them into their opposite. He says, for instance, and he offers you something completely unexpected. He tells you practically, if not explicitly, I define movement as rest. And then everybody probably goes, what? Now I'll show you. And then he makes these unbelievable conceptual structures of his phenomenology. And you have to follow him step by step as he does it. It's very difficult to follow. You have to focus. And then he takes you into a position that he completely inverts things, but you believe him. You know what is this? This is the guy who takes a rabbit and a hat and say, I'm going to make this rabbit disappear. This is illusionist, and this is quite deliberate. So let us go further, and we'll try to conclude on this. I'll provide some links for those who want to go deeper into this. There is quite a lot of things that can be said. This is just the tip of the iceberg. By splitting entelehia and energeia, entelehia ends up to be the end, telos, of movement, whereas the movement ends up being energeia. So what Aristotle defined as movement for Heidegger is in fact rest, the possibility of movement, because he wants to know what is being movable. Aristotle, on the other hand, is trying to describe the actual movement. And when Heidegger comes to Energeia, Energeia is unfinished work, with a clear allusion on that the original meaning of Energeia is from human artifice, from human production, technical production. Which is nonsense. It is not. And therefore, entelehia would be the end of this Energeia in the sense of Fertigsein and Herstelltsein, being like Herstellen. It's the origin probably of his term Gestell, his later term, and it talks about techniques and technology. It's kind of like structure that is being posited to stand before. I don't know, let's say stand before us. So this is presence and being there. As you can see, I believe already, this has nothing to do with Aristotle. We began with a quote from a lengthy quote where Aristotle, not only does he explicate what Energeia is, he gives you very striking examples. Examples that really make you think. And really, you cannot just behave as those examples are not there, because entelehia is not something that is finished. It is something that is something that is complete. And being complete in Aristotelian terms does not imply being finished. It does not imply that it is in a discrete moment of time. It is in the stretch of time, let's say. For instance, the time cannot be understood in this reified manner, as Heidegger assumes. And the ultimate irony is, and I think everybody who knows about Heidegger is smiling now, this is what Heidegger tried to prove in Sein und Zeit, that somehow this original metaphysics of the Greeks understood time as presence, as now, precisely in this way of discrete series of present points, let's say, quantified time, as it were. But the only man doing it here in this series of lectures on Aristotle is Heidegger himself. Aristotle didn't do that. Aristotle's understanding of time in physics is another story altogether. But in understanding of Energeia, we have an example of understanding of time which is not understanding time as present and being as presence. Only way you can understand Energeia and entelehia as present is presencing, because those are activities. They are expressed by verbs, and it's not for nothing that they are expressed by verbs. And Thomas Aquinas, hundreds of years later, says, when talking about semantic problems of periheimarmene of Aristotle's on interpretation of the copula est in sentence, he says it doesn't signify how he says it, it signifies consequently, because what is signified in this verb to be transcends the synthesis that is produced by the verb when you construct subject and object in sentence. But what is present in the verb is always present. It is not created by this synthesis. So the being, for Thomas, for instance, transcends beings. It transcends verbal discrepancy, semantic discrepancy of subject-object propositional sentence. It's something more original than that. And let us not forget, it is something far more original than language. In Heidegger, everything is language, is in language, as in all 20th century philosophy, unfortunately. This is also one of the reasons you can get anywhere with that. So he completely inverts Aristotle. What Aristotle has is precisely what Heidegger seeks. This is not metaphysics of presence. This is something completely different. This is opposite. This is not metaphysics of absence, but metaphysics of presenting, of participation, parousia, and metexis. And this brings us to a crowning question of really in how deep is the divide between Plato and Aristotle, because I'm now starting to use Platonic terms. But this is a story in itself. Okay, I will conclude reading Aristotle now. There are a lot of things, and this can be a very fun butchery of Heidegger, but I'm not into that. I just want to conclude on this note. Some of the philological criticism raised against Heidegger, concretely in this lecture from 1924, is, I think, conclusive. I just gave you some snippets, because I'm not the expert on ancient Greek, and I don't want to claim authority, but others who are authorities, and I know enough Greek to understand that they are authorities because I can translate what they translated. Pass judgment. This is Hochstaplerei, as Germans would say. This is hijinks. This is not philosophy. What is very interesting, and what I want to stress, is a lot of people attending these lectures who became great names. I don't know, I think Marcuse was already at this 1924, I think Heidegger was in Marburg then, this is before Freiburg. I think Marcuse was, for instance, already his student. Hannah Arendt, I'm not sure, probably yes. But Heidegger's lectures were all in this way, in this early period. It gets worse later when he starts with Hölderlin and Nietzsche. God forbid, God save us from that. But none of these people, to the rest of their lives, I think, either didn't realize or never said it publicly that they fell for illusionist trick and were instrumental in creating what is now known as continental and to a large extent American modern philosophy and postmodern philosophy. Because, when we say deconstruction, now you can see why Heidegger wants to deconstruct metaphysics. You know why he does it? Because this metaphysics he is deconstructing is his own construction. It's very easy to deconstruct something that comes from your head. And this comes from his head. These things are not, when you mistranslate Energeia, when you split terms that are synonymous or make synonymous terms that are never synonymous, when you do that, and you know what you're doing because he's a very educated man, he knows what he's doing. When you do that, there's nothing to talk about anymore. And the paradoxical thing and tragic thing is that he's obfuscating precisely what he claims to be seeking. This thought that transcends the presence, the being there, and such categorizations that reduces things to something rather banal. That's what he does. Not Aristotle, neither Plato, neither Plotinus, neither Thomas Aquinas, none of them. No one before modernity. There are, of course, roots in previous ages for this, but I won't go into that. I can only say that Eric Vogelin called Heidegger Gnostic, modern Gnostic, who is in fact worst of all. Although he admired his philosophical abilities, same as Hegel's, but he says he goes the furthest, and mind you, Eric Vogelin is a younger contemporary of Heidegger. He could have fallen for it like Hannah Arendt, like any of those people, but he didn't. And you rarely hear people talking about him. He's not that popular. He is known figure, maybe mostly in USA, but he stayed sane. He didn't fall either for the leftist version of postmodernity, either for this Heideggerian, although leftist version is also to a large extent now Heideggerian. Now, in conclusion, also one thing that is very important, Heidegger's destruction of traditional metaphysics is a fraud. It's a destruction of nothing. It's a destruction of Heidegger's construction of metaphysics, and at the same time destruction of his early philosophy, because all of this goes into his Zeit. This is terminology he uses there and the way of thinking, and then later on he changed, but he goes nowhere all the same. The very idea that you can take a concept and claim that from some one concept or misunderstanding of something everything went to hell is a philosopher's holy grail, because it reduces the most abundant thing in human experience in everyday life, that is to say history, to one point into which you can shoot your intellectual magic bullet. Yet things don't work that way. That's one thing. The other thing is Heideggerian way doesn't work for sure, because it can be proven. As for countercurrents and those white nationalists or whatever, and Colin Cleary, I think I can conclude that gentleman is a dilettante in philosophy. He's obviously not aware that of Heidegger's works that he should have read in order to write authoritatively on Heidegger's interpretation of Aristotle or his ideas about Latinization of Greek terms and so on and so forth. And I think this is clearly demonstrated. If it is not demonstrated, please go pick up Heidegger's lectures. They were published in 2002, and there you see that Heidegger takes Aristotle's Energeia as being instance of presence, of Gegenwart, and so on, same as later Latin Actualitatis. So I don't see reason why I should waste my time on such people. So I hope that this was a satisfactory answer. It went a bit long. If it were longer, it would be probably more interesting, but I have to keep it somewhat in the confines of this podcast. If you want to discuss further, I would very much like it. So please attack the comment section. This is Branko Malic of Kali Tribune signing out.